first of many because it really has been a great series. Well, today we have the pleasure of hearing from Marcia McNutt, who graduated from Northrop in the class of 1970. I hope you read about Marcia's many accomplishments in the invitation to this breakfast. I was researching Marcia's background on the web, and I had more hits when I put her name into the search engine, including over 100 articles that she herself has authored. And there's about 2 more articles for each one of those that someone else has authored about her. A pretty impressive background. In fact, one of the things about it that I don't think any of our other speakers have had is she's got a Wikipedia article about her. And as I was reading it, I said, you know, this is pretty interesting because it adds a lot of color to her background. And so instead of listing stuff from her CV, I thought I would quote from Wikipedia. It says, in part of it being an interview, McNutt said that growing up in their household, women's education was a tradition and a norm, and that her parents encouraged Marcia and her sisters, Jill, Meg, and Jane, to pursue academics. She was the valedictorian of her class at the Northrop Collegiate School in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then received a bachelor's degree in physics summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa from Colorado College in 1973. And I took enough math here to figure out that she did all that in 3 years. As a National Science Foundation graduate fellow, she then studied geophysics at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where she earned a PhD in Earth Sciences in 1978. Her dissertation was titled Continental and Oceanic Isostasy. Did I say that right?
Yes, yes. Ah, good.
McNutt is a certified scuba diver, and she trained in underwater demolition and explosives handling with the U.S. Navy SEALs. I don't know if any Blake graduates have that. Marcia has 3 daughters, Meredith and identical twins, Dana and Ashley. Ashley, by the way, was Miss Rodeo California in 2009. Marcia is also a horse enthusiast. At one time, she had 6 horses and used to show her horse Lulu. Her husband, Ian Young, is back in Salinas, California, taking care of the horses, while Marcia works primarily in Washington, D.C., travels all over the world, including a trip that's coming up next week to Moscow. I understand she's going to try to figure out this whole Trump. We need more people like Marcia McNutt. Please welcome her to.
I hope you speak Russian.
Well, Woody, that was great. I don't know if whatever I'm going to present today can possibly top that introduction, so maybe we should just go right to questions. Anyway, so in deciding what to talk to you about this morning, I was thinking back to a meeting I was at not too long ago that was called by the ODNI, which is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And it's a meeting that he has periodically. I don't know if it's every year, but it's every couple years, where he calls upon some leaders, thought leaders, leaders in the defense community, leaders in the academic community, to look out 20 years or so in a time horizon to find out what should the intelligence community be looking at that are very important trends that the Director of Intelligence really needs to be tracking, that they should right now be investing in. And at this meeting, one of the panels was a panel that was looking at international issues. And at the end of the panel on international issues, something that one of the people on the panel was talking about led me to ask the question, does it concern you that so many young people in America today are going online and can't distinguish in what's popping up in their Facebook pages and other internet feed between what is true and what is fake news? And the moderator of the panel said, what disturbs me most about your question is that your question is absolutely relevant to a panel on international security. And so then the panelists discussed how important it was for everyone educating young people today to teach them the skills for how to distinguish what is real from what is fake, what is evidence-based from what is trying to reel in gullible people and get them to believe something that has an agenda behind it. So what I wanted to talk today about is, does basing decisions on real evidence matter? Because whether it's a young person falling victim to some fake news, or whether it's voters basing their vote on something a politician tells them that isn't quite right, it really does matter where you get your sources of information and whether that information is based on true evidence. And it's incumbent on all of us as parents and as educators to teach our students that their sources of information do matter. And if something doesn't seem quite right, or if we don't know the sources of information, and if we don't know how to ferret out where that information came from, we need to learn how to do that. We need to learn how to go to original sources. And I'm just going to give you some examples of some things in the long ago past and some things in the recent past that are examples of good examples and bad examples of how not using evidence really can matter. So let's start with the word of the year from 2016 from the Oxford dictionaries, post-truth. I'm not sure this needs much explanation. The fact that they would pick this word as sort of saying it all of explaining what happened that defined 2016, that there was an era in which post-truth became a defining statement for 2016, that there was an era in which we went beyond truth, and that was somehow, I think, not okay, but that's what happened. And the reason why I'm so concerned about that is that this is my institution. This is the National Academies of Science. I'm the president of the National Academy of Sciences, and there are three academies. There's the National Academy of Science, the National Academy of Engineering, the National Academy of Medicine. And the National Academies together, of which I am the chair, put out about 200 reports a year on numerous topics. The National Academy dates back to the Civil War. It was chartered by Congress, but it's non-governmental. We don't receive an appropriation from Congress. We are completely independent. We are apolitical. We are unbiased. We are chartered to provide advice to the government, but we are not a government agency. And the important thing about the National Academy of Science, and we have here Albert Einstein. This is the statue of Albert Einstein, which graces in a prominent place in front of our building, is that evidence underlies everything we do. And because evidence is so important to us, the question I'm asking this morning is, what has been the track record of evidence in guiding decisions, and does it matter to pay attention to science? That is the foundation of what we do at the National Academy. And if evidence doesn't matter, then the whole foundation for my organization obviously doesn't matter. And I want to argue to you today that it does matter, and we should care about evidence. So here's my first example. Let's go to the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919. It was a highly contagious disease. When it first started, when it first came out, the National Academy recommended, the government came to the National Academy of Sciences and said, people are falling victim to this flu. What should the military do to protect its troops? The number one recommendation that the National Academy made was, you have to stop housing troops in these giant barracks. The barracks are breeding grounds for this pandemic. The military said, they rejected the recommendation, saying, this is not the protocol of the military. We are a military. We put troops in barracks. That's the way we do things. So, in the end, the flu affected 20 to 40% of US troops as it went rampant through the barracks. And in fact, the mortality rate from the Spanish flu was higher than that from enemy fire. So the moral of the story here is that it's all well and good that the military had its rules, but you ignore the rules of nature at your own peril. Nature will not be denied. And the pandemic won out in the end. So, one can say that perhaps the government learned its lesson from this. And years later, when the AIDS epidemic came up, in more than 50 years later, and again, the National Academy was called in because people were falling sick to this strange infection that originally people thought was maybe just affecting IV drug users and the gay community. But the National Academy said, no, this is not something that will be confined to just certain populations. This will be a global pandemic. And they said, it's absolutely essential that the US government invest in a public health campaign for everyone, and that the US government invest in the National Institute of Health to come up with treatments and cures for HIV/AIDS. And the government responded. This time, they did not ignore the warnings from the National Academy of Sciences. And it was important because this was under then President Reagan, whose motto was, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And yet, he said, in this case, government can be the solution to the problem. And government did come up with a solution to HIV/AIDS. And this was important because at the time, elsewhere in the world, this was the time when the US acted. And at the time, longevity, life expectancy had been increasing in these African countries, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Kenya, South Africa. And so it wasn't clear that AIDS was going to be a global pandemic. US acted here. These African countries did not. They actually denied that HIV caused AIDS. And in fact, soon after, life expectancy fell from a high of 55 to 60, 65 years, fell back to what it had been before childhood inoculations were common in those countries, fell down to back to 40 years on average because of the AIDS epidemic. So here's another case. All right, so many of you remember when you could smoke on airplanes, and they had smoking sections and non-smoking sections. So this was another recommendation from the National Academy. Health advocates came to the Academy and said, we think it would be a good idea to ban smoking on flights because all of the air is recirculated on flights anyway. And so why have smoking and non-smoking sections? Everyone's breathing the same air anyway. So the Academy said, okay, we'll look into it. But when the Academy looked into it, what they found was that the quality control on the passenger compartment, on the cabins, was so poor that there actually were pinholes that were developing in the pressurized compartment, and it was only the tar and nicotine from cigarettes that was plugging those pinholes and maintaining the pressurization in the cabin. And that if smoking were banned on airlines, that and it were done all at once, that the airline cabins would lose pressurization and people wouldn't be able to breathe at 30 to 40,000 feet. So the National Academy wisely recommended a phased approach, that instead smoking should be banned only on shorter flights, such that the flights under 2 hours in duration could ban smoking, because that wasn't long enough that these pinholes would cause a problem, and on longer flights they would still allow smoking. And then there would be enough smoke on enough flights to keep the cabin safe. And that would give enough time for the airlines manufacturers to fix the problem, and eventually no flights would have smoking. And that's what the FAA did, and gradually smoking was banned on all flights, and now we fly smoke-free. So this was a 2009 report. We're all accustomed to watching on CSI, and this was one of our few reports that actually was shown on CSI. So there's actually an episode of CSI in which one of the CSI investigators picks up this report and says, no, we can't use that evidence. The National Academy says that that is faulty science. This one, called Forensics on Trial, showed that much of forensic science is actually based on bad science. So things like blood spatter patterns and bite marks, and using hair that doesn't have any scalp attached to it with DNA, has so little science in it that it can't be used in a court of law as actual evidence in a trial. So as a result of this report coming out, thousands of death row cases are now under appeal. What's unfortunate about this, however, is that our new Attorney General has, I should say that as a result of this report, a panel was set up of scientists to improve the science in forensics. And it was a panel that included judges and scientists, and they were trying to elevate the level of all of the forensics that's used in the court of law. And they were working hard since 2009 to try to make sure that all of this sort of shaky evidence was now going to be put on a firmer footing. Things like the striations on bullets that come out of guns and things like that all could be used again in trials because it had a much better basis in science. So when the new Attorney General was appointed, he disbanded this group and said, no, we don't need to do this anymore. And everyone's scratching their head saying, why wouldn't you want to use good science in the courtroom? And everyone's puzzled by this. Isn't scientific evidence important? And so now everyone's on sort of shaky ground saying, should we be using the old standards, which have been shown to be scientifically invalid? There are no good standards yet ready to replace it. So this is very disconcerting. Obesity. This is another one that is troubling. What smoking was to my parents' generation, the epidemic that led to massive increase in lung cancer, obesity is to my generation and my children's generation. It is a completely preventable disease and disability that is leading to a public health epidemic that is costing the nation massive amounts of money in diabetes, heart disease, lost work, incredible amounts of lost quality of life. The Academy put out a report on what needs to be done to prevent this epidemic in obesity. And one of the important things was changes to the school lunch program. Get rid of excessive amounts of fat, salt, etc. No more French fries, fried foods, etc. So what was troubling about this was when an announcement from the new Secretary of Agriculture, Perdue, that rolled back the school lunch program changes that had been championed by the last administration. And of course, Michelle Obama, never one to mince words, came out saying, why don't you want our kids to have good food at school? What is wrong with you, and why is that a partisan issue? Now, I actually see both sides of the issue here. The Trump administration's view, and I see their side of it too, is that too many of the kids in the school lunch program were not eating the healthy food. And so the Trump administration said, well, if they're not eating the food, let's go back to the old, unhealthy, fatty food, because at least they'll eat it. I guess my view is, I think this is a time to sit down and rethink the school lunch program. The better thing to do is not to go back to the old food that they were eating and getting too fat on, but rather to sit back and have both sides agree, what is our goal here? It's to have healthy food that they will eat, but at least start with the young kids first coming into the program and give them healthy food, because if they don't start getting their taste buds accustomed to the fatty food, at least you can get them to start eating the healthy food at the very minimum, and then start figuring out what you're going to do to the kids that were accustomed their entire life to eating the bad food. But you certainly don't want to get the young kids in kindergarten and first grade accustomed to eating the unhealthy food. So immigration in the US, this is a report that came out last year, a pair of reports, in time for the election, where there was so much debate on the wall and what's the impact of immigration in the US. So these two reports were very complex and had a number of messages. And I think these perfectly illustrate the issue about, that I talked about in the beginning, of how, depending on what someone's objective is, how they can go into any complex issue and cherry pick their bottom line, put it into a headline, and try to get you to believe what you want to believe. And these two reports were cherry-picked more than any reports probably in the history of the Academy, depending on whether someone was pro-immigration or anti-immigration. And as it turns out, the immigration, because it's so complex, there are cases to be made that immigration can be good for the country or bad for the country. And let me just give you an example from the second one, the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration. First-generation immigrants who come into the country definitely cost the country money. When they first come across the border, their children have to be educated, they need extra social services, etc. They do cost money. And they typically cost at the local level, in the counties and the cities along the border where they're typically entering the country. And so they are a drain on local economies. But the children and the grandchildren of those immigrants pay that back multi-times over. So that is why proponents of immigrants have an easy time saying, we are a country of immigrants, and immigration has been good for our nation. But that paying back multifold in terms of taxes and new industries started and innovation is typically at the federal level. And so the sum total of it is positive to the country, but it's not necessarily at that local level where the drain happens. So you can make the case that it's either bad for the country or good for the country, depending on your perspective. If your perspective is local at the first generation, or whether your perspective is national, multi-generational. And so, of course, if you look at these headlines that came out, here's the headline from the Huffington Post. Immigrants don't steal your jobs and wages, billionaires do. Or here's Breitbart News. Breitbart. National Academy study shows $500 billion immigration tax on working Americans. So both of those were, of course, cherry-picked from the report. And neither of them is a lie, but they're both narrow interpretations of what that report said. So it's caveat emptor. So I'm going to end here because I'd like to have some discussion, but I just want to say, check your sources. Gullible is not a good quality for anyone. So I'll leave it there. Yes.
At the present time, U.S. Congressman Nolan and Emmer are attempting to block a study that would examine the effect of copper sulfide mine pollution draining into the boundary waters canoe area. Do you have any response to this?
Oh, well, okay, so the question is, congressmen are trying to block a study on the effect of copper sulfide pollution draining into the boundary waters. Why would anyone want to do that? What's wrong with them?
Well, a lot of their constituents are miners. And so they want to protect those jobs. Yes,
protecting jobs. Okay, so here's the issue. There have been a lot of cases where in trying to protect jobs in the short term has actually backfired, because what happens in the long term is that you never can hide something like that for very long. You should point to them the case of Flint, for example, the water in Flint. People were trying to protect themselves by covering up the Flint water crisis, and that came out. It was people trying to protect their backsides that they covered that up, and when that came out, it was worse in the long run. So if there's anything that history has shown, is that cover-ups only in the end backfire in big ways that are always worse.
Hopefully.
Any other questions? Yes.
I've read a little bit on connecting climate change to a national security issue.
Yes.
Your first story started to touch on that a little bit. Has your organization been brought into those discussions?
Yes. Yes. So many of our climate change reports have been funded by the national security community, by the CIA, by ODNI. So I don't know of anyone in the national security community that is a climate change denier. They consider climate change a threat multiplier. I personally chaired a pair of reports on climate intervention that were funded by the CIA. And the reason why they were concerned about it is climate intervention is a series of potential moves to not mitigation, not climate change adaptation, but actual hacking the planet, things like geoengineering. And the reason why the CIA was so interested in it is the potential for another nation to actually put particles in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight. And what's the possibility that another nation could do that to us and perhaps worsen the drought in the Southwest or increase the floods in the Midwest by doing that? And what are our options for knowing exactly who did it and how long would it last, and could we stop them from doing it? And the actual fact is there are no laws that would stop someone from geoengineering the planet right now. In the back. Yeah.
How does the Academy of Sciences deal with the tension between what you can measure scientifically and what often is a human effect that is psychological or emotional?
Okay, so we do have a very large division in social sciences at the Academy that works very closely with our other groups. When I first arrived at the Academy, the social sciences group sort of did its own social science studies. And I've been increasingly integrating the social sciences through all of the other divisions in the Academy with the view that we have to, in all of our studies, understand the social science component of every study, because no matter what we're looking at, it either affects how people will react, or we have to understand its impact on people, because you know, there's this issue that it's not just the evidence. It has to be how the evidence is presented to people, or really understanding what the issue even is. Because we might go into a problem and think, oh, this is what we think the problem is, but we may not even be looking at the problem in the right way without having the social science that precedes it. So I think that this is exactly the issue. Yeah, in the back there. Yeah, in the white shirt, right. Yeah.
I don't exactly know how to ask the question, but it seems to me, at least here at Lake and when I went to college, we were always trying to go after original sources.
Yes.
Or as close to
Yes,
we can.
yes, yes.
And it seems that that isn't how education is presented these days. Is that a correct statement or not? And what do we do about it?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really, really, really good question. I was talking to an educator the other day, I think the person was from Arizona State, who had a course that this person taught, and he said what he did was he had a course that the students had to write papers that went to original sources, and it was absolutely firmly enforced that every source had to be original. And it was amazing how hard it was for the students to actually do that. Because, for example, so many things that the students thought were original sources actually weren't. And they had to keep digging down deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper until they actually got to the original source. Because so many things were reviews. Nope, the review isn't the original source. You have to go deeper and deeper and deeper. You know, a web link is an original source, etc. And so it was wonderful for the students to have to do that. And I really urge every educator to give at least one assignment in which the students need to do that, because it's hard to do and it really is instructive. Because you're so right, so few people do that anymore. Yes?
Thank you for speaking and for your work. We're hearing more about the social determinants of health, such as education, employment, food, housing, parks, transportation, that have a bigger impact on health, whereas healthcare only accounts for 10%. These other things account for 40 to 70%, depending on your source. How does the National Academies work on a national basis when most of those actions are on a local or regional or state level?
So the National Academy of Medicine has a new project out called Vital Directions. And it's dealing with the fact that although the United States spends more on healthcare than most developed countries, we, in terms of our actual metrics, we lag most developed countries. And the reason for that is the actual fact that we are spending so much on medicine and we spend so little on all of those other determinants. so little on things like worrying about appropriate housing, good nutrition, and all of the other social determinants on well-being. And so the Vital Directions actually looks into how important all those other factors, and we can throw pills at people forever, and that is not going to be the most cost-effective way to actually get to a healthy population.
I think we have time for one more question.
Annie?
Marcia, you've been an advocate for women in science your whole career. How are we doing?
Good question. Okay, so here's the question is, how are we doing with women in science? So there's good news and there's bad news. Okay, so the good news is the participation of women in science, particularly in fields such as biology, chemistry, geosciences, social sciences, is way up. In fact, women are overrepresented in those fields, much more than 50%. The participation of women in physics and engineering is up, but it's not at 50% yet. The bad news is that we've still got this leaky pipeline. And what we're seeing is that even though women are coming into the field in huge numbers in undergraduate and graduate school, we're seeing that at various career levels, whether it's in government, industry, academia, they're dropping out at too high a rate compared to their male colleagues. So we've got a new study that was just very generously funded by the National Science Foundation to try to look at across different fields as to why we've got great participation rate in some fields and not in others, and why in all fields we're not getting the advancement rate that we need. And what we can do, what are some good examples of programs that are getting women all the way through to the highest levels of achievement. Is this a lifestyle issue? Is it, what is it that discourages women from persevering in these fields? We've been making modest gains, but it's not a pipeline issue because we've had lots of women for a long time, and so if it were just not enough women coming into the field, we should have. No, there have been enough women coming into the field. We should have seen them passing through at this point, and they're not. But thanks. Thank you, everyone. This has been great.
It's so great. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
I got something for you. Don't go away.
My sister Sally was in Marcia's class and said it was a great class, only about 30 girls, really tight-knit, everyone knew each other. She said, we knew Marcia was really smart, but we didn't know she was brilliant. One thing I do know about climate change, it's still really, really cold in Moscow. I hope this comes in.
Thank you. Yes,
Thanks
thank
very
you.
much, Marcia. That was great. Terrific.
Northrop Blue.
I hope you'll all join us. Keep your eyes open for the notices. We're going to start with Ann Stabney in September, and we got a great lineup for that year as well. So I hope to see you at future breakfasts.
That was really good.